All right, welcome again, everyone. And we just wanted to welcome you all to this Grand Rounds lecture that's co-sponsored by Psychiatry and the Center for Faculty Development. We're delighted to have you all here for the annual Maurizio Fava Lecture on Wellbeing. And without further ado, I would just like to turn things over to Dr. Luisa Silvia, who will be introducing the lecture and our speaker.
All right, well, welcome everybody. It's great to have you all here for the Maurizio Fava Lecture Series on Wellbeing. My name is Dr. Luisa Silvia, and I am the Director for the Office of Women's Careers within the MGH Center for Faculty Development. The organizer of this lecture and is the Director of the Office of Wellbeing, Dr. Darshan Mehta, and unfortunately, he could not be here today since he is out of the country, so I am standing in for him today. Today's lecture from Dr. Suzanne Koven will be Reading Kafka in the Hospital Cafeteria, Reflections on 17 Years of Literature and Medicine at Mass General. But first, just a quick word on Dr. Fava, which is this lecture series is named after due to his vision and advocacy and well-being of the MGB academic medicine community. Dr. Fava is the chair of the Mass General Brigham Academic Medical Center's Department of Psychiatry, the executive director of the Clinical Trials Network and Institute, the associate dean for clinical and translational research, and the Slater Family Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Fava is a world leader in the field of depression and clinical psychopharmacology, who was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2023. He has edited 8 books and co-authored more than 900 original articles published in medical journals and international circulation, articles which have been cited more than 100,000 times in the literature, and with an H index greater than 150. Not too bad. So we're thrilled to have him here today, and he'll say a few words after Dr. Koven speaks. All right. So now it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Suzanne Koven, who's our speaker for today. She received her BA in English Literature from Yale and her PhD from Johns Hopkins. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from the Bennington Writing Seminars. After her residency training and chief residency in medicine at Johns Hopkins, she joined the faculty of Harvard Medical School and practiced primary care, internal medicine, and MGH for over 30 years. She's an associate professor of medicine in global health and social medicine at HMS and holds the Valerie Winchester Family Endowed Chair in Primary Care Medicine at Mass General. In 2019, she was named the inaugural writer in residence at Mass General. Her essays, articles, blogs, and reviews have appeared in the Boston Globe, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, New Yorker, Psychology Today, the LA Review of Books, the Virginia Quarterly, and on and on. And I recommend that you check out her website because a lot of her pieces are there, and it is really fun to read some of her things that she's put out there. Her monthly column In Practice appeared in the Boston Globe and won the Will Solomon Award for Excellence in Medical Writing from the American Medical Writers Association. Dr. Koven co-directs the Media and Medicine program at HMS and speaks to a wide variety of audiences on literature and medicine and the role of women in medicine. Her essay collection, Letter to a Young Female Physician, which again, a great read as a director of the Office for Women's Careers, please check that out, was published by W.W. Norton and Company in 2021. And she has a memoir called The Mirror Box coming out in 2026, which will also be published by W.W. Norton and Company. So in sum, we have a fabulous writer and clinician here amongst us, and I'm so thrilled to invite her up to the podium to give her talk today. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dr. Sylvia. Thank you to the joint sponsors of this lecture, the CFD and the Department of Psychiatry. And thank you to Dr. Fava. I must tell you, I have been honored to give named lectures before. I have never given a named lecture with the person with the name sitting in the front row. So this is a special honor. I'd like to take a moment also right now to thank Felicia Marks and Brittany Mancini, who are the program managers for the MGH Writer in Residence program, to Dr. Josh Metley and Dr. Mary McNaughton Collins, who have encouraged and supported this program from its inception in the DGIM. in 2015, and to Valerie Winchester, who endowed the chair that allows me to continue to do this incredibly joyful work. Now, I'm going to be, as the title advertises, I'm going to be reflecting on 17 years of literature and medicine at Mass General. I'd like to take that experience and place it in a very broad context of the long history of medicine. But first, I want to start with a more personal kind of story. And it begins here. This was the spring of 1990, the end of my chief residency year in the Department of Medicine at Johns Hopkins. I was about to start in practice here at Mass General in a brand new primary care practice, the Bullfinch Medical Group. What I didn't know then is that I would spend my entire career there, my entire clinical career, 32 years in that same practice, very happily. When I look at this picture, I find myself wondering some things. Well, of course, one thing I wonder is why we ever thought exaggerated shoulder pads were a good look, and I hope they never come back. But I also wonder why I didn't notice at the time that there were so few women in medical training then, not just at Hopkins, anywhere. But the other thing I wonder is why I was so certain, having barely started my career, that I had already made a choice about it that was irrevocable. And the choice I thought I had made was that though I had been an English major, though I considered myself a humanities person, though I had taken the bare minimum science after college to go to medical school, that I had now made the decision to leave all that behind. I had thrown my lot in with team science medicine, and that was just the way it was going to be. Over the next several years, I got settled in practice and in family life. And sometime in my 40s, I sort of heard the siren call of my old self. And I started taking a course here and there at Harvard Extension School, literature courses, writing courses. I eventually went back to graduate school and got a master's in nonfiction writing. I started writing professionally and writing mostly about medicine, about the experience of doctoring. And yet, strange as this may seem, the divide in my mind was so deep that it never occurred to me that my reading and writing life could have anything to do with my medical life. That all changed in one conversation. I was having my annual career checkup with Dr. Michael Barry, who was then interim division chief for general internal medicine. And I was telling him, just a sort of making conversation about, taking writing courses and literature courses and all that stuff. And he told me there was a new program that Mass General was signing up for that was going to be funded by Mass Humanities, which is based out in Northampton. And they would kick in a few bucks to pay for pizza for staff to gather for dinner once a month and talk about literature. There were 15 hospitals around the Commonwealth that were subscribing to this program, and primary care here at Mass General was the local subscriber. And he said, they said they would send us an English teacher to facilitate this conversation, but seems to me like you could do it. And so I started doing it. And if I tell you how liberating, how wonderful, this was to bring myself together. Well, here's how I can explain it. I figure this is Department of Psychiatry, so this is a good place to tell you about a recurrent dream I've had. And I've had it since childhood, and it goes like this. I think it's probably a pretty common one. I'm in a very familiar place. My elementary school, my house, Mass General, but I'm in a very unfamiliar part of that place, a wing, a stairwell, a corridor that I never knew existed. And I have two reactions to finding myself there. One is that I'm very anxious because I have a terrible sense of direction. And I feel like, uh-oh, I've gotten myself hopelessly lost. My other reaction, though, is one of jubilation. The place I thought was only just so big turns out to be more capacious than I imagined. That is how I felt that day when Michael Barry said, "Why don't you run literature and medicine?" That is how I have felt every day since then. So at first, we met in the Garden East room across from the main cafeteria, ate cafeteria pizza, sat under the fluorescent lights. There is nothing garden-like about the Garden East room, though I think one time we did see a mouse. And despite the sort of inauspicious ambiance, there was something really magical about this almost from the beginning. We migrated, of course, during the pandemic to Zoom. Now we are hybrid. Half of us eat pizza and sit under harsh fluorescent lights. Half of us join from home, and it works very well. And we read plays and novels and short stories and poetry and journalism and nonfiction. Occasionally we discuss a podcast or a film. In the early years, the recommendation of Mass Humanities was that we stick pretty close to a medically themed reading list. But what I felt after a while was that if literature is great, then it has something to tell us about the human condition. And if it has something to tell us about the human condition, then why wouldn't it be relevant to healthcare workers? So we've branched out considerably. So we started in 2007 with funding, 6 sessions a year, once a month. The funding dried up, and then a very interesting thing happened. Every single hospital, except one across the Commonwealth, dropped the program. I mean, the pizza wasn't all that expensive. But I don't know, it just sort of faded. Mass General doubled down on it. First, the Stokel Center picked it up, and then the DGIM picked it up, and we expanded to where we are now, which is 10 sessions a year. We open registration twice a year, although truthfully, anyone who wants to come anytime, it's fine with us. We usually get about 50 plus registrants, and we don't really advertise very much. The one time we advertised more vigorously, we got 150 registrants, and there just wasn't enough pizza, nor enough chairs. I would say on average about 15 to 25 attend each session. And these are clinical, non-clinical, younger, older. We have retirees who have been coming back for years. Folks who do not work in the hospital sometimes come in. We've got, medical students, folks from other hospitals, spouses, and so forth. Well, then things sort of expanded, which is that in 2015, Dr. Josh Metley, division chief in the DGIM, said, this is pretty great, but not everybody's going to stay after work. This is pre-pandemic. Not everybody's going to stay after work and eat pizza and read Shakespeare. So how do we sort of get this to more people? And he encouraged me to create what we called rather grandiosely the Writer in Residence program. And then within 4 years, Dr. Slavin said, yeah, why don't we just offer these activities to everyone? So where we're at now is we have the monthly Lit Med group. We have a monthly writing workshop. We have on-site small group discussions where I will go into an administrative or clinical team with a poem and just start a conversation. We have community events such as the annual celebration of National Poetry Month in April. To my knowledge, we are the only hospital in the United States that has an annual celebration of National Poetry Month 2 years ago. That consisted in this very ether dome of 2 physicians, an administrator who's sitting right here, and a nurse acting out a scene from King Lear with a community discussion after that. I do a lot of one-on-one mentoring of people who are interested in writing. There are a lot of people in our community interested in writing. And then in partnership with the Russell Museum, we have an author conversation series. Our writers are many and they are prolific. This is a tiny and only recent sample of their output in both the medical and the lay press. Felipe Marcondes did a beautiful graphic essay in the New England Journal about the experience of being an undocumented doctor. He's a primary care physician. Shannon McDonald, who's a radiation oncologist, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about why it is that interstate televisits are no longer covered. One of our medical residents, Leah Vasquez, wrote a poem that was published in Annals of Internal Medicine. And just the other day, psychiatry's own Sarah Darguth, a psychologist, had a piece in Stat about what it was like being in the therapy room in the days following the recent election. As I said, this is a tiny sampling of what our writers have been up to. And then, just for me personally, as a natural extension of the program here, I was invited back in 2019 to co-create a new program at the medical school, which started out as a certificate course, is now both a certificate course and a master's program, where people come from all over the world, journalists, activists, clinicians, who want to use some mode of storytelling to address a public health issue. Since the pandemic, we have been gathering virtually, and it's still pretty great. The master's course is 100% in person and full time. It's hard for me to look at this low quality screenshot to this day without tearing up a little bit. You see, when the pandemic came, I thought, well, you know, this was all fun, but I don't think anyone is going to care about literature around here when people are dying and people are stressed to the max. The opposite happened. Within 2 weeks of the first lockdown, I was getting more manuscripts in my inbox than I had gotten in months before. And by April, we were gathering a Saturday afternoon drop-in virtual poetry workshop, primarily aimed at residents, many of whom were attending from the hospital in PPE to read poetry and to write poetry. Our resident writers were so prolific that we had to have an event for them by the time June rolled around. And I think we highlighted 5 of them. We could have had many, many more. Pooja Yaramili, who was a medicine and global health resident on March 26th, said, the rhetoric is that we're heroes. I don't feel like a hero at all. That was at Kevin, MD. On April 2nd, Clayton Dalton, who's an emergency medicine resident then in the New Yorker, wrote about noticing his colleagues' eye color for the first time because their faces were obscured by masks. And in the Department of Psychiatry, residents Jack Turbin and Chase Anderson in STAT, this was in May 13th, addressed the joke that was going around about, hey, you better watch out. Your ICU is now being run by a bunch of psych residents. And they said, guess what? We are, and we're doing a really great job. So it's not a joke. And so we had this wonderful event for them. So looking back at what I thought about this choice I had made, I just realized how very wrong-headed it was, which of course the Greeks could have told me. Apollo was the god of both poetry and healing. There you see his lyre for poetry and the snake for medicine. This imagery doesn't do a whole lot for me. I like to sort of put it in terms that are more congenial, I think, to our current sensibilities. And though this is obviously very reductive, we have a left brain and a right brain. And I think many of us, have gotten into the habit of thinking, oh, I'm a left brain kind of person. I'm an engineer. I'm logical. I'm a doctor. I'm a scientist. Whereas a right brain person is more intuitive and creative. Well, I think we all know that to practice medicine or nursing, or really to do anything, it's very handy to have both halves of your brain. And that I've said this often, and it sounds rather glib, but I mean it. I would say that in my decades of practicing primary care medicine, I used more of what I learned as an undergraduate studying novels and poetry than what I learned in the year following college in physics and organic chemistry. And I think any clinician knows the truth of this. So, what about narrative, storytelling? Well, to say that narrative is essential to medicine seems almost tautological. It's like saying words are necessary to language. It's because storytelling is how human beings communicate. It's how we build relationships. It's how we foster empathy. If I were to ask anybody in this room, why are you here today? Or anybody on Zoom, why did you sign in today? Not one of you would say, well, I got the notice in the email and I clicked the button and here I am. You just wouldn't almost be constitutionally able to do that. You would say, well, I was always interested in it and I thought of that. You would tell me a story. And of course, our patients tell us stories. That is what we do, right? Whether you're a surgeon, a psychiatrist, an internist, or whatever, this is what we do. If you had to explain to a Martian what we do, you would say, well, this way it goes. Someone I've never met comes to me, they tell me their story, I listen to it, I write it down, and then I tell a bunch of other people their story and see what they think of it. That is pretty much what we do, and that is what clinicians have always done. When I went to graduate school at the age of 52, so by the way, if you're thinking about pursuing a second interest, it is absolutely not too late, unless that interest is neurosurgery. But for the humanities, what's great is you can get a very late start. I learned about something called the Freytag pyramid. And this is essentially a diagram of how stories work, how plots work. So you begin with the exposition where you meet the main character, Cinderella, mother dies, she got mean stepsisters. They make her sweep the ashes. And then some stuff happens. There's going to be a ball, fairy godmother, pumpkin, etc. And then there's the big crisis, 12 o'clock. And then a bunch more stuff happens. Well, glass slipper and etc. And then resolution, prince, happily ever after. You can take any plot, any Western traditional plot, I should say, because there are storytelling modes that don't fit this scheme, that are more circular and less linear. But most plots with which you're familiar can fit into this scheme. When I saw this in graduate school, I thought, this looks awful familiar. Where have I seen this before? Well, of course, I had been doing it my entire professional life. Instead of Cinderella, we have a 55-year-old man with chest pain. We meet our protagonist, our patient. A bunch of stuff happens. Well, we call it the PMH. Freytag called it the backstory. And then there's the climax. What brings them to the emergency room? What brings them to the clinic? What's the chief complaint? And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff happens, the data gathering phase, usually, the hospital course. And then the resolution is perhaps the diagnosis, the assessment and plan, and so forth. And so whether or not we think of ourselves as literary nerds, right-brained people, frustrated English majors, we as healthcare workers are storytellers. This is what we do. Oh, and by the way, a word about my pet peeve. Anecdotal medicine, I was taught, is kind of a dirty word. It's the opposite of evidence-based medicine. But why? We use anecdotal medicine in every sphere of our practice. In patient care, we don't treat individuals as generic, that we treat them as individual stories. In medical education, we use the case method. Yes, we tell students about general principles, but then we tell them about this particular person with diabetes and that particular person with diabetes. Research, of course, has its case reports. And in public health, as I've learned in our program over at the medical school, there is no greater tool, no more powerful tool to affect policy change than a story, because stories are what people care about. It's just the way we're wired. So this is a facsimile in hieroglyphics of the first known written medical case history. It's part of a series now called the Smith Papyrus from 1600 BCE, and it's a series of trauma cases. And they all kind of follow the mode of case number 4. If a man has a split skull, moor him with bricks until he seems stable. So sort of like a, ancient Egyptian cervical collar situation. But here's the interesting part. Then do the same for any man who has a split skull. You're confronted with the specific, and then you use it to make a generalizable insight. Is that not part of the way literature works? When you read Harry Potter, Anna Karenina, whatever you read, why are you reading it? There's a certain suspense and entertainment value, and there's the pleasure of language. But you read it because there is something about that individual's story, that individual who you will never meet because they do not exist and never did, that has something to say about human truth generally and about your truth specifically. So this sort of way of framing information medically is actually quite close to literature. And then Hippocrates really sort of brings it to the next level, which is that he, in Epidemics and elsewhere, he's telling a story in terms of a sequence of events. So here it's from Epidemics, 500 BCE. Silenus had become overtired from drinking and exercising at the wrong time. Well, who among us hasn't? And then the first day he vomited, the second day was delirious, the sixth day perspiration, the eighth day cold sweat, the 11th day he died. Why does he bother doing this? Well, he's doing this, I think, for the same reason that Aristotle emphasized the importance of sequence of events. If B can't happen until A happens, and C can't happen until B happens, that starts getting us thinking about cause and effect, which also gets us thinking about meaning and even moral. And we intuitively know this, and how do we know it? What is more frustrating, shouldn't be, but what is more frustrating than when a patient tells the story all out of order or draws sort of wrong-headed conclusions about cause and effect? Ever since I started taking that pill, my toe's been hurting. That kind of thing. We should be more respectful, of course, of patients' own internal logic and experience, but intuitively it makes us bristle because we want to be Hippocrates. That's what makes sense to us. All right, now we're going to skip way forward into the future. When I left Hopkins, by the way, I signed a contract saying I would never give a lecture and not mention Sir William Osler. So here it is. By the time we get to the mid-19th century, storytelling and literature have become really part of the physician's education. And the way Osler put it was to keep his mind sweet. The modern scientific man should be saturated with the Bible and Plato, with Homer, Shakespeare, Milton. To see life through their eyes may enable him to strike a balance between the rational and the emotional, which is the most serious difficulty of intellectual life. I hesitate to bring Freud to this audience, but Freud, of course, was a great writer and certainly very well-versed in literature. He wrote about Moses, he wrote about Hamlet, and of course he wrote about Oedipus. But his case histories are beautiful works of literature that are now more likely to be read in literature classes than in psychiatry departments, and yet they are part of our medical heritage. Some physicians of this era actually blurred the line between medicine and literature to an even greater degree than Osler suggested. This is Silas Weir Mitchell, who's considered the father of neurology. That's a portrait of him by John Singer Sargent. He has a very complicated legacy, which I won't get into, just to say that if you've heard of him, you've probably heard that he was the one who devised the rest cure, by which women with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, or who were just plain annoying to their families, were locked in their rooms, force-fed high-fat diets, and forbidden to read, write, paint, or be exposed to music. That was the bad part. And in fact, he is the villain of the famous short story by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. He was also a villain in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. But he did other stuff too, better stuff than that. And one thing he did was he was in charge of a hospital during the Civil War, a hospital in Philadelphia, where he was charged with taking care of wounded soldiers who had neurological and psychiatric consequences of their war wounds. And it was there that he noticed something, which is that there were a lot of soldiers who came in having had limbs amputated. There were 60,000 amputations during the American Civil War because the nature of the munitions was such that if you got hit in the torso, you would die. And if you got hit in a limb, you would lose that limb and probably die as well. But he noticed that virtually all the amputees had feeling in their missing limb. This was a phenomenon that had been noted centuries before by Perret, but it had never had a name. He and Silas Weir Mitchell called it phantom limb syndrome. He also said, hey, you know, I think this is a neurological thing. I don't think this is a psychosomatic thing. Well, why am I bringing him up? Well, because when time came to report his observations at this hospital, did he do it in a medical journal? No. He did it in the Atlantic Monthly as an anonymously published short story. Why did he do that? I have a lot of thoughts about that. That's a different talk. But he himself was a poet and a novelist. And in some of his writings, he indicates that he felt that the experience of these men was simply too complicated, too rich in a sense, to fit in the confines of a medical journal. Now, skipping several decades ahead to someone who had similar feelings, we go all the way to Oliver Sacks. Now, in the summer of 1969, Sacks was working at a nursing home in the Bronx, and there were some 80 patients there who had been there since the 20s in a state of suspended animation, having contracted a post-viral encephalitis. And Sacks said, hey, there's this new drug called L-Dopa that they're using for Parkinson's disease. I wonder what would happen if we gave this to these patients. And he gave it to them, and they came to life. They were cognitively intact, and they started moving. He published his findings as case reports in medical journals, BMJ, JAMA, and the medical world was not all that interested. And Sacks himself was rather dissatisfied with these case reports. He said, I don't want to write case reports. I want to write biographies. I want to write what these people's lives were like before this happened to them, during those decades when they were suspended, and then what has happened to them since then. He published that as Awakenings, which is considered a literary masterpiece still, and then he went on, as you know, to have a great literary career. Now, by the early 70s, when he published this, Sacks was well aware that he was a bit of a throwback. In fact, the physicians he admired were Osler, Weir Mitchell, those literary physicians of a previous era. What was it that had changed? Mark, you're going to have to help me with time. Okay. What was it that changed? Well, This is from Abraham Nussbaum, who's a psychiatrist and a medical historian. And what he says is that around the turn of the last century, physicians started seeing themselves as scientists because they had more reason to. And Foucault, the French critic, calls this the great break in history of Western medicine. By the time we get to the Flexner Report in 1910, which, as you know, was a sort of broadside about modernizing medical education, Flexner said, forget about Greek and Latin and Shakespeare. We don't need any of that. Our students only need chemistry, biology, and physics. But within 15 years, Flexner himself thought that things had gone too far. And he said, something more intellectual is also needed. What I think is that LitMed and our little program here is part of a sort of large corrective movement to try to swing the pendulum a bit back into balance. And here are some other examples. I'm going to skip that for a moment. Oh, by the way, it's very easy, I think, for us, very tempting to think that everything sort of went south with corporatization and with the electronic medical record. I've made that argument myself. I think we'll be seeing more and more of the argument that AI is ruining everything. I noticed when we took on Epic a few years ago that as a primary care physician, it was very difficult to figure out what had actually happened to a patient, what their story was with problem-based charting. And I rather cheekily wrote in this piece, getting back to Cinderella, that if one were forced to tell the story of Cinderella with problem-based charting, you would be left with poverty, soot, inhalation, family conflict, but you would never know what happened to Cinderella. That's all very cute, and it's true, but the divide happened much earlier than this. And among the correctives we've seen are medical humanities programs all over the world. There are virtually no medical schools that don't have one, and many hospitals have them. A profusion of narrative writing by physicians and nurses, poetry, memoir, fiction, graphic novels, nonfiction, and so forth. A profusion of narrative writing by patients. The medical memoir used to be an occasional thing. Now it's virtually constant. Narrative medicine, which is a relatively new discipline founded at Columbia in around 2000, which essentially says, this is Rita Sharon, who's both a primary care physician and a scholar of Henry James, has a PhD in English literature, essentially says that by reading texts closely and discussing them, you are better able to metabolize, interpret, and be moved by the stories of illness. Even the New England Journal of Medicine, as you know, now publishes personal essays almost every week. This was unheard of 10, 15 years ago. And right before the pandemic, I was delighted to participate in the first ever narrative symposium at the New England Journal of Medicine, along with Perry Klass, Danielle Ofri, the late Fitzhugh Mullen, and other doctor-writer colleagues. Well, what's the point of all of this, other than that I like it? You read a lot about how reading enhances empathy. How do you measure that? This is a recent article. I could have pulled any number of them, but the basic formula is you give medical students or clinicians, nursing students, whatever, something to read, something to discuss, and then they fill out a standardized questionnaire about empathy, and you say, well, this seemed to increase their empathy versus a control group. I will confess to you, I have never done this with our literature and medicine group. Why? One, because I feel like the point's already been made. And also, I feel like empathy isn't the only thing this is about. Let me explain. Oh, we send out surveys twice a year. And yes, everybody says they feel more compassion, they feel more collegiality, job satisfaction, and so forth. But what's much more interesting than the surveys are the ad hoc comments that drift in. And they often have very little to do with the books themselves and more to do with the experience of discussing the books. So here was someone who wrote in after we had discussed Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. I love this. This was actually at the start of the pandemic. The conversation reminded me of the best kind of jazz music, spacious enough to hold any flourish folks wanted to throw in, but always with one foot rooted in the core characters and scenes Morrison created for us. Magnificent. There are a lot of book to bedside moments. I grew up in medicine hearing a lot about bench to bedside. Now I'm hearing a lot about book to bedside. We had read a novel by J.M. Coetzee in which a university professor has an affair with a student and is exposed and publicly shamed. We talked a lot that night about the role of shame in medicine, the shame of being ill, the shame of caregiving. And the next day, I got this email from one of our nurse practitioners who said that she had seen a woman with a new anal lesion. She didn't really see what the big deal was, why this woman was so upset about it. And then she was thinking about shame and thinking about Coetzee and realized, I get it now. I love this quote, which was from an interview that President Obama did right before he left office with the book critic from the New York Times. As you probably know, he's an avid reader, and he read a lot of novels while I was in the White House and said fiction was useful as a reminder of the truths under the surface of what we argue about every day. You know, the hospital has a lot of busyness and hustle and bustle, and I feel that literature reminds us of the truths that underlie that. We deal with incredibly profound stuff, and we don't have any time or space to talk about it. Literature provides that vehicle. Here's a couple of examples of that. This is William Carlos Williams, who was both a practitioner and a poet. He wrote poems on his prescription pad in his office in Rutherford, New Jersey. And he has a poem called Complaint, and it begins, "They call me and I go." He's going out on a snowy night in a house call. I brought this poem to a group of nurses on the floor in the middle of the day. You would think they would think that was weird. They don't think it's weird. Nobody thinks it's weird because people around here are dying to talk. And I said, you know what? You get called all the time. The call buzzer goes off, a beeper goes off, the phone rings, there's an epic message. How do you feel when you're called? And the answer's pinballed around. I feel apprehensive, I feel angry, I feel anxious, I feel joyful, I feel dutiful, I feel proud, I feel curious. And what we realized that we had all inhabited this moment 1,000,000 times, as most of the people on this call and in this room have inhabited it 1,000,000 times, and we had never interrogated it until Williams invited us to do so. That conversation took place the first week in March of 2020. And within a couple of weeks, I wrote a piece riffing off of it as a minor somewhat darkly comic note, I'll point out that it was rushed to publication on April 13th. Why was it rushed to publication? Because the journal didn't know how long the pandemic would last. And so everything COVID was being rushed to publication because, after all, it could soon be irrelevant. Sadly, that was not the case. How are we doing on time, Mark? Okay, so I'm going to skip that. Oh, this is just such a great quote, though. We have to give James Baldwin a nod. You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. And reading and talking about books breaks down isolation like nothing else I know. I'm going to skip now to Kafka, as promised. I think reading enlarges our view of our patients and ourselves. Kafka was a Jew from Prague who wrote in German. He died in 1924 of tuberculosis, but his three older sisters survived him. They were quite close. They were all murdered in Auschwitz. And in 1916, he published a novella called Die Verwandlung, The Metamorphosis. And if you've not read it since high school, or if you've never read it, the plot is very easily summarized. A 27-year-old office worker named Gregor Samsa is the sole support of his family with whom he lives. He doesn't get out much, but he has a portrait of a woman that he's infatuated with on his wall. One day, he wakes up from troubled dreams and finds that he is a giant bug. He can't go to work, so he loses his job. His family loses support, has to take in boarders. They're repulsed by him. They, at a certain point, stop calling him by his name. And ultimately, he dies of unknown causes, but one thinks that it's probably despair. Now, the novella has been read as an allegory of anti-Semitism, Jews as vermin, an allegory of capitalism, of alienation of modern man. But there's a case to be made that it's an allegory of medicine. For one thing, the Samsas live across the street from a hospital. And then there's this moment. His teenage sister, Greta, is the only one in the household who will actually look at him. This is a modern dance performance of the piece. And at one point, Kafka says, she came in on tiptoe as if she were visiting someone seriously ill, or perhaps even a stranger. To wake up and find your body utterly changed and incapacitated in a way that affects every aspect of your life, that's a pretty good evocation of illness or injury. Now, we read this in Literature and Medicine, and here's what we talked about. If you were a primary care doctor, a really good one, and you made Gregor's problem list in Epic, and you addressed all of these things, his physical deformity, his depression, his disability, and the family discord, man, you would be a really, really good really good primary care physician. But what Kafka tells us through this narrative is that there was more to Gregor's experience. He was ashamed. He lost his identity. He was never going to have any sort of sexual life. He feared being disgusting. He was lonely. So reading helps us restore balance. We need the right, we need the left. We'll give Kafka the last word. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. I submit to you that right now in medicine, in this country, in this world, we have a lot of ice. We need a lot of axes. Thank you.
want to give you this.
Thank you very much.
You know, I have to say that you're, first of all, it's a reminder of the importance of balance, of finding balance between, you know, in what we do. But how we can be inspired by literature in our medical practice. And, you know, when I read the Metamorphoses and short stories by Kafka, my favorite story was the tree trunks in the snow. You know, the fact that they seem like nothing can move them, then a little bit of wind could shake them. And then Kafka concludes, says, but that's not even true. Neither one of the two impressions is correct. And, you know, as a clinician, when we hear the stories from our patients, we draw an initial conclusion, then we move to another one, and then we realize that neither one may be correct. So I think that you know, your lecture really reminds us of the importance of being inspired by literature and finding that balance. But thank you so much. That was fantastic.